Alors bonsoir, mon nom est Daniel Salé, je suis professeur à l'Université Concordia, professeur de sciences politiques, et je remercie Alain Gagnon et les organisateurs du colloque de m'avoir demandé de présider cette dernière séance de la journée. Une séance qui va essentiellement comporter une discussion, je dirais, libre format, avec trois invités. Je vais vous les présenter dans 2 secondes. Before we go on, first of all, I will, for those of you who didn't understand what I said in French, don't worry, it will be all in English. So we have 3 panelists. Basically, the theme for this panel, the end of the day panel, is essentially it's about reconciliation. It's about federalism and Indigenous peoples, and we are, as you know, going to Quebec City, and it's the road to reconciliation to a certain extent. And as we go through Quebec, well, through the territory here, we'll be passing by a number of, actually 3 Indigenous territories. When we were in Montreal, for those of you who are not familiar with Montreal, we were on Mohawk territory, on ceded Mohawk territory. As we go east, further east, around Drummondville, we will be going through Abenaki territory for a few kilometers, quite a few actually. I don't know how many, but certainly several dozen kilometers, all the way past Bécancour. And after Bécancour, we'll be entering what is known as the territory of the Huron-Wendat, who are basically outside Quebec City in Wendake. So I want to acknowledge this, that as we are going through, and this is an important thing to acknowledge because obviously we have been historically on Indigenous territories, and I think it's an important thing to do to recognize more and more that we are indeed very often on unceded land, by the way. 3 panelists, I will introduce them right now. We have among our panelists Mr. Ghislain Picard. Perhaps you can say hi, Ghislain. Ghislain is, for those of you who are not from Quebec, Ghislain is the Grand Chief of the Assembly of First Nations of Quebec and Labrador. Has been for more than 2 decades now, 25 years. So he's a permanent fixture. And we like him very much because I think he's one of the people who have, to a large extent, helped us understand Indigenous issues and who has been a very important spokesperson for Indigenous people in Quebec and also in the rest of Canada. We will also have among our panelists Jannick Dubois. Jannick is an assistant professor of political science at the School of Political Studies at the University of Ottawa. She is actually quite a prolific writer. She has written quite extensively on issues related to Métis in particular. She's interested more generally in governance practices of Indigenous and linguistic minorities in Canada. She's currently working on a book called Contemporary Métis Governance and Politics in Canada with Kelly Saunders. And finally, we have among our panelists Mr. Rai Moran. Rai is the director of the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, and it's his job basically to guide the creation of an enduring national treasure that is a dynamic Indigenous archive built on integrity, trust, and dignity. Before joining the TRC, Mr. Moran was the founder and president of Yellow Tilt Productions, and he has a number of professional skills and creativity that actually have earned him quite a few awards, including a National Aboriginal Role Model Award and a Canadian Aboriginal Music Award. Rai is a proud member of the Métis Nation in Manitoba. I thought we could start, given the nature of the theme of this conference, we could probably start with a very general question. And I would like to know what is your assessment of Canadian federalism for Indigenous peoples. Jannick, for example, I know you wrote an article back in 2013, I think, in the Canadian Journal of Political Science, in which you have a rather upbeat view of what Métis have been able to accomplish within Canadian Federation and what they can accomplish in the future. Maybe you can address that. Chef Picard, obviously, I think, despite imperfections, one could probably say that Canada has not shown, perhaps some would say that Canada has shown a certain opening towards Indigenous self-government. they would say, well, James Bay Agreement is an example of that. Nunavut, Nisga'a. Do you think that is still the case? Do you think we can make that kind of assessment? And finally, to Mr. Morin, is the TRC an example of the possibilities for future transformation of the institutional structures in place for federalism? So I thought maybe we could start with Yannick with this question that I asked.
I actually, before I start, I want to introduce myself. I'm Yannick Dubois, Yannick Nitishnakas, Sokechuan, Nehia Weaski, Egwa, Apitabogosan Aski Ochinia. I want to present myself and acknowledge the territories from where I'm from. So Daniel Saleh mentioned all the territories we're passing through, but I grew up on Cree and Métis territory, and a lot of the things that I've learned over the years come from that territory. And it's there that I learned a lot about innovative ways in which Indigenous peoples use federalism to their advantage. So Danielle asked a question about, the Métis, have they been able to carve or advance their agenda within Canadian federalism? And I don't know if I'd say Canadian federalism, but I'd say federalism, Indigenous federalism, has allowed them to create a space where they've been able to develop their own governance structures, adopt their own laws, develop their own constitutions, and interact with other governments. Now, that's a rosy picture. It's clearly not all rosy. There's a lot of challenges ahead, both internal and in building relations with other governments. But I think the initial assessment on that is, even though sometimes our old writings can haunt us, I think that one is still true, that at least for the Métis, federalism, Métis way, in the Métis fashion, has been somewhat of a success.
Chef Picard?
Oui, c'était quoi déjà la question?
Oui, alors... Well, basically, maybe I could just... Basically, for you, the question about the assessment that you would make of Canadian federalism from your point of view. Obviously, there are some imperfections, but some people might argue that, some of the treaties that have been negotiated, modern treaties that have been negotiated over the past few decades, are examples of a flexible federalism, possibility of self-government. So I'd like to know what your point of view is on that.
Merci beaucoup. I like some imperfections. Kwezi po hugarat non tamit chef kwa tsuda gwenda hanagini uti wadat metagot tsi gwenda pazmi apisha tsi de top shish nshda dum tagot te she okheldemanina te wejia naban stamot shtigan hanu de go sida gonet shepe tagot tsi tudmak. Who speaks French? Anglais? Seulement?
Only English only?
Seulement? Ah, finalement. Who speaks Innu? Innu? Nobody? Then I'll respond in Innu then. I was privileged to be, as I said, a front row observer of major achievements for our people over the last 30 years, going back to the Constitution patriation of 1982. And before that, and in reference to Danielle's question, we've made great strides in having our peoples, treated the way that we would expect to be treated by this country. Danielle mentioned and referred to one example which still stands today as a model in terms of negotiating with Indigenous peoples, and that's the James Bay Northern Agreement back in '75. But what is often forgotten about this agreement is what led to it. And back then, the Premier of Quebec was Mr. Robert Bourassa. He had a major project in mind which led to his election as a Premier, and it was one to design to develop hydroelectricity in James Bay, northern parts of Quebec. And this was back in 1970, 71. So without any consideration, the Quebec government at the time moved up its bulldozers and started digging. And they continued digging until the Cree Nation had them stop with an injunction before the courts. And what you will hear today about that history is that the name of Robert Bourassa and the name of the Cree leaders back then as well. But often what is forgotten is the fact that Mr. Bourassa didn't negotiate out of his generosity. He was forced to negotiate. And this is really, you know, a part of our history that is often overlooked or interpreted in a way that I guess provides more balance in favor of Canada. And to me, this is where we come into play to, I guess, write the history the way it should be told. And I think it's very important to understand that, because the one example that comes to my mind is the fact that the UN has adopted a Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in 2007, September. And this really came from our efforts, our lobby efforts at the international level, which span more than a quarter of a century. As a matter of fact, it was a Mohawk chief back in 1923 that set foot before the League of Nations at the time to make that first movement towards the recognition of our peoples at the international level. That was in 1923, almost a century ago. And to me, this really speaks so much about the resilience and obviously the affirmation of our peoples to be properly recognized. And again, speaking of the constitution of the country, because it is part of the 150 years ago, and again, our peoples mobilized back in the mid-70s to make sure that if the Constitution becomes Canadian, as it is today, that it would properly recognize our peoples. We had a train like this one leaving the West Coast and gathering people along the way just to protest before Parliament Hill in Ottawa. Make sure that the Constitution, Canadian Constitution, would recognize, as it does today, our peoples, their rights, Aboriginal and treaty rights. So it didn't come easy, and it's still not easy today. And there's certainly more to say, and maybe I'll have an opportunity to do that.
You will. Mr. Moran, maybe a word about TRC.
Merci. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me, Jocelyn. Thank you for your nice words in your new language, too, and that introduction. I think it's such an appropriate point to start in the language. At least what is told to me by the elders that surround us at the National Centre is that, be it a conversation around federalism or be it a conversation around reconciliation, is that sovereignty actually starts with speaking our languages. And for me, my own personal story, being a Métis from Manitoba but raised out west, it was really my grandmother's generation that lost her language, that kind of Red River Michif, and she heard it spoken in the house, but being raised out west, it was easier for my family to just kind of, you know, move into the fold and with Western society there. So when we talk about federalism, we can think, well, there's lots of people who think about federalism in the room, but what I tend to think about is what are we talking about when we talk about Canada, really, and how are we going to get along, and how are we going to live together? How do we structure ourselves? And one of the things inherent in federalism and the way we've drawn our maps, even, and the way we've created our society, is that it hides what was here before Canada was here. So there's other ways to draw our maps, and there's other ways to organize ourselves politically. And that's, of course, Indigenous sovereignties and nationhoods that are trying to bubble up through this system that has only very recently been imposed on this country. And of course, we remember, when we remember the truth, is that Indigenous nations have existed here for not just hundreds of years, but millennia as well. So be it 13,000 years in the west to 7,000, 8,000 years out here. When the TRC starts its reports on history and where the history of the residential schools comes from, it actually starts the history conversation all the way over in Europe, and with the passing of the papal bulls and things like the Doctrine of Discovery and Terra Nullius, which gave people the right to just kind of waltz into this territory and claim it, and of course start drawing lines on maps. When we think about federalism as well, we think about what Canadian identity is, and we can talk about who we are as Canada and who we don't want to, or how we don't want to see ourselves. And one of the ways we are having trouble seeing ourselves at is, of course, as what amounts to a culturally genocidal or a genocidal society. And that's, again, front page of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report, is that the residential schools themselves were an attempt at cultural genocide, and when we understand the bigger ramifications of what happened before the residential schools, through the residential schools, and the massive loss of life that continues to this day, be it through suicide epidemics, shortened life expectancy of Indigenous peoples, or other responses to deep and prolonged trauma in this country, it truly does become deeply appalling in terms of who we are as a country. So that's something that we need to acknowledge and we need to address. One of the greatest challenges that we have with this country is in understanding not just the history that we have, but the current gaps that exist between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians. And part of that gap is actually created by the very federal nature of our country. On one hand, Indigenous peoples are meant to be a federal responsibility, but on the other hand, oftentimes the services that they receive or the systems that they interact with happen at the provincial level. And that's why what the TRC did in its calls to action is make very strong calls for action around accountability, and really starting to ask all levels of government to accurately document the number of children in care, the disparities in income and life expectancy and maternal health and incarcerations and interactions with justice and police systems, not to mention a whole bunch of other indicators. But when we think about what that is going to take, it becomes very complicated. So right in the middle of the TRC's calls to action is the call for what's labeled the National Council on Reconciliation. And the National Council on Reconciliation is meant to be a new council, a new accountability body that will keep an eye on us as a country in terms of how we're doing and whether or not the deplorable gaps that exist between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples are widening or closing. Right now we have a little bit of information here and there, but we don't have a comprehensive annual state of the relationship report. And that's what we're trying to get to. And in fact, there's very little accountability in this country that actually appropriately addresses the interrelationships between the federal and the provincial system and the kind of the political football that exists related to Indigenous issues. So even the Federal Auditor General doesn't really have the ability to peer into what's happening at the provincial level, and of course the Provincial Auditor Generals don't have the ability to look the other way. So one of the great challenges that we're going to see in the articulation of this National Council, which is meant to be a new significant accountability body in this country, is the potential for federal legislation to bind federal governments to produce information up to this new body on monetary issues, on the state of relationship, but having a sort of lack of ability to bind provinces via legislation to produce this information up. So it's going to require some sort of memorandum of understanding or covenant of reconciliation between provinces, probably at the First Minister's level. And then there's a question about enforceability and teeth with that as well, because there's no real enforceability at that point. We're just going to have to rely on the goodwill of people. But on the final point there is that's one of the really inherent challenges about reconciliation, and I think that was really reflected even in the TRC's delivery on its mandate. So while our friend here, Jocelyn, is absolutely right that the churches and the governments got dragged kicking and screaming into reconciliation, this is not something that they did voluntarily. The process of actually starting to reconcile now, and the awakening that Canadians are starting to have to want to embrace this, is actually coming voluntarily. You can't actually force it. People have to want to do it, and people, I believe, have to feel a moral sense of duty to actually improve this relationship that we have. So when we look at who else is accountable, it is municipalities, it's provinces, it's the business sector, it is churches, it is provinces, and it is the federal governments that are all collectively responsible for reconciliation. And somehow, in this federal system that we have to figure out how to create accountability and good flow of data in that system.
Maybe one last intervention. So, Ryan, you were
I stirred the pot up.
Yeah, exactly. So we'll let you maybe yeah, and I think it's a question that maybe Yannick and Ghislain could also talk to.
So to the first question, I mean, anecdotally, my friend is a surgeon in Winnipeg. I mean, when somebody has a medical emergency in Winnipeg, Indigenous or non-Indigenous, they walk into the Winnipeg hospital and they receive treatment at that level. So there's still that kind of basic requirement for services in urban centers, at least, that's not really going to change. The big things that are, I mean, the most appalling in this country is that there's continued discrimination in funding levels and on funding levels specifically, based solely on the distinction of race. You know, where a kid under the federal system or falling under a federal system is just worth less in the eyes of the government. In the city of Winnipeg, a kid coming in from the north under the federal system is worth $9,000 a year, whereas a kid under the provincial system is worth $13,000 a year. You know, in the eyes of the funders. So those are just basic inequalities that are really, we have to start with equality first, and that's going to be a big issue moving forward. But I'm sure others have lots to say about this because this question's a really big one. On the issue of the what's happening and what the potential is of the National Council. So the Prime Minister just shortly before Christmas on December 15th, which is 1 year after the release of the TRC's final reports, made a pretty important set of announcements. On one, he committed to what he says are permanent bilateral mechanisms between First Nations ITK and or AFN ITK and Métis National Council on an annual basis, and he committed to that. He gave the National Centre a little bit of money, which was nice, and then he committed to the creation of a 6-person committee that's going to work to establish the terms of reference for this National Council on Reconciliation. So that's pretty exciting. It's one that we've spent a lot of time thinking about over at the National Centre because of the natural relationship that happens there. We see there being good potential for that to be sort of a secretariat council type role, but there's a lot of discussions to happen around that. Last question was what's happening out there. So there has been some, I guess in a way, quick wins. The Prime Minister committed to the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Inquiry, which was a call to action, called for adoption of UNDRIP, which was adopted, of course, not implemented at all. There are broad efforts, I would say, generally across the country in the field of education, both at the post-secondary level and in the K-12 system. But on that, it's quite varied in terms of how much is actually happening. In terms of training public servants, which is called Action 57, the Canada School of Public Service is starting a national series of dialogues on how to, with Indigenous peoples, specifically to learn and understand what they need to be telling public servants in order to work with Indigenous peoples. That's happening also in the province of Manitoba. The city of Winnipeg has implemented a similar initiative. BC is rewriting its entire curriculum from the K-12 level. Multiple cities have adopted years of reconciliation. Public libraries are adopting special rooms. The accountability piece is a big missing piece so far, and really the deep structural work, the actual implementation of something like UNDRIP, which is defined by the Commission as the first priority in terms of the principles of reconciliation. UNDRIP is the framework for reconciliation in the country. I don't even know if we're at the start of that, really, in meaningful, tangible terms.
On the Daniels, for those of you who aren't legal junkies, the Daniels decision was about whether or not non-status Indians and Métis fall under Section 9124 of the Constitution, and therefore whether they're federal responsibility. And the court ruled that they are under federal responsibility. So I'm sorry I'm putting my back to people. But so one of the consequences of that, so if I go back to the first question on, has federalism served the Métis? Well, while the Métis have used federalism to carve out a space for themselves, Canadian federalism actually hasn't done anything about it. So they've done this despite the fact that there is no actual recognized space for them within the Canadian federal landscape. So I think Daniels gives us a little bit of an opening by saying, well, actually the federal government can be at the table. It's permissive, so it doesn't actually say that the federal government has to be at the table, but should they want to take part in these wonderful things that are happening, the federal government can be part of it. But I think the other important lesson for federalism from Daniels is that the court doesn't say it's about the federal government. It says it's about the Crown, and that also engages the provinces. And so all of those areas where the provinces have been active and provinces' obligation towards Indigenous peoples, and that doesn't go away. Just like reconciliation doesn't actually just flow from the federal government. It's a Crown obligation. So I think here we see just the extent to which even the courts have reaffirmed that both federal and provincial governments have a role to play in carrying out responsibilities towards all Indigenous peoples, non-status Métis and First Nations, but also towards reconciliation, which is part of the goal that the court was working towards.
Thank you. Justin?
Well, first of all, I'm a member of the Innu Nation. The Innu Nation, that's Eastern Quebec, 1 nation out of 10 in Quebec, and 9 communities. We're still very, very fluent in our language, Innu language. I would say maybe roughly 65% of our people still speak Innu as a first language. With regards to the Daniels decision, and you're right, it's really about who has the responsibility for the Métis and non-status, and the side that I want to bring up is the whole issue of identity, and it's very important when it comes to our region, because if I'm not mistaken, the Métis National Council considers to have membership from the West Coast all the way to Ontario, and that's where it stops. And the Métis notion in Quebec somehow plays itself differently. And to me, that's very key to understand. And the impacts of Daniels, and potentially other decisions as well, because we certainly are involved in a vicious cycle of bringing just about anything and everything to courts. And this is also the history of the relationship. Going back many decades. And in terms of Daniels, what we've seen in Quebec over the course of the last year or two, it's situations where you have different groups claiming to have a status and not really hesitating to consider the courts as an avenue to have that status recognized. We have even nations in Quebec that we never heard of. I mean, it goes to that extent. And to me, it's going to be very, very important for governments to finally come to an understanding with the proper authorities within the Indigenous peoples and their organizations, to really recognize the fact that only those nations have the right to determine who their peoples are. And I think it's a very, very key question because this issue has no limitations. It goes all over the place. On the issue of the TRC and the calls to action, I think one important piece, and I think Rai referred to it, it's education. And I think that in order to get movement, we'll need to count on leaders. And they could be coming from anywhere, any sector. it's going to be important to get moving, because on the political side of things, we're facing hurdles on the UNDRIP and the proper implementation of UNDRIP within this country. We see that the government has different interpretations, which may not be similar to our interpretations of what UNDRIP says and how it should be implemented. So there are political considerations in terms of the 94 calls to action. And to me, the ones that have the most chances of moving forward are the ones that call on peoples to get involved. I spent a few days last week on the land with a group of students from Quebec City, 30 non-Indigenous students, and they're wanting to learn. They're wanting to change the way history is taught in their schools. They said, well, I think it has changed. There's a line that speaks to residential schools, but it doesn't say anything as to what happened before and how they were implemented and what happened after. And I think we need to get more involved. Just last week, we were involved in a press conference calling on the Quebec government to do more in terms of the curriculum in schools and making sure that there's proper balance in, especially in the contribution of Indigenous peoples, going back to the first contact. I think it's very important that we also consider that it's really in all of us, in our hands, to make sure that those calls of actions get moving.
I find it interesting and almost odd in a way that we're here talking about federalism, which to a large extent is perhaps for people who are Democrats and liberals and people who want to embrace diversity. It's probably one of the best systems we can think of, but technically it is, but in fact it seems to be problematic. I'm almost tempted, I know Alain had a question, I'm almost tempted to address him one question myself. I mean, Alain is one of the people who basically coined the term multinational federalism. Why is it that doesn't seem to be working? When we hear Ghislain Picard, when we hear Raimorin or Jenny, I mean, yes, there are certainly things that are possible, but why is it that multinational federalism, we shouldn't even be here talking about this? I mean, it should be sort of a natural thing, don't you think? So maybe instead of having you ask your question, I'll ask you that question and perhaps to address this. And you can ask your question at the same time if you like.
Okay, well, I didn't expect this. Obviously, I've been promoting multinational federalism in Canada for some time. And I think the Acadian, the Québécois, the Aboriginal, the Indigenous nations, the First Nations, so to speak, should have a right to be represented and speak for themselves. And then when I look at the commissions we have had over the years, going back to the Erasmus-Dussault Commission, 1995, 1997, major commission, I thought something would be occurring there. And instead of that, we've seen this report, impressive report, with a lot of intellectual investment. This has been essentially tabled. And essentially people who are advancing this project of a multinational federation for Canada have been challenged, criticized as being un-Canadian, as being challenging the nature of the country, and obviously I take that as being an unwelcome criticism. So I think we need to reconsider the role of the Senate as we discussed today, but the Senate ought to be much more a house that will represent regions, nations in particular, if it is to be useful. If it is simply to be a ventriloque of the House of Commons, this would be useless. So we need to rethink the Senate in a way that it would be a House of Region and a House of Nations, and then that would be giving some concrete meaning to federalism. So the question I had was, in a sense, for Ghislain in particular. Ghislain Picard in particular, why is it that the Aboriginal people are not more, well, I'm from the Eastern Quebec area, so why is it they are not more aggressive, more challenging the central government? It seems to me that the resilience is there, but what my mother would call resistance, she's a very strong feminist nationalist, the resistance is not there enough, so they need to challenge the power that be in Quebec City and in Ottawa. And I find, well, let's say there are people who feel that they are not challenging enough the central state and collaborating too much with the central state. So how do we find a way not to be co-opted and find a way to really put forward the message that ought to be put forward? So hopefully that my question was clear enough.
Chef Picard, that's a very good question. What do you think federalism, how do you think we can challenge or transform Canadian federalism precisely to address the kind of issues that Alain Gagnon has been talking about?
Very, very interesting question indeed, and there are so many answers. Well, the issue really speaks to our own capacity to come together. As I said earlier, Quebec alone, that's 10 different nations, probably 10 different ways of viewing that issue, that question. And in Canada, that's 60 nations. So you have maybe 60 potentially views on the issue. And I guess it takes me back a few years, back in 1992, and this was the very last attempt at reforming the Constitution so that we could deliver what the leaders back in the early 80s were set to deliver, which is to have a proper form of indigenous governments in the country. Between 83 and 87, that failed. In 92, it failed as well. I think most of us know that history. And the reason it failed in the first place in 87, and to me what I recall, and I recall one premier speaking about that issue, and it's the only premier who was not part of the Constitution, saying the problem and the issue is one of power and land. So this is where really we come face to face with not only the Canadian government, but also with the provincial and territorial jurisdictions. And on the issue of the multinational federalism, back in '92, through the talks leading to the Charlottetown Accord, many had expressed the possibility of even having the Parliament, the Canadian Parliament, open its doors to a structure that Indigenous peoples would design themselves. I remember MPs suggesting that the old library in the back portion of the Parliament, just take out all the books, move them to somewhere else, and then have that building set to welcome, Indigenous form of structure in a manner that resembles what we've seen in Scandinavia, Norway, Sweden, and so on. And to me, this is one way, and it takes me back to what I said earlier, which is our own capacity to agree on one way of doing this. In Quebec alone, you have nations that are very, very nationalists. They wanna, I guess, protect the fact that they were originally nations that decided for themselves their present and their future, and they don't want to give that up. But on the other hand, and on the other side, you have other nations that are willing to, I guess, the best word that I can come up with is, in a way, compromise and live with what we have today, and make sure that any kind of structure, any form of government would be able to harmonize its way of doing things with the governments in place. One of the arguments back in '92, again, Charlottetown Accords, were whether indigenous nations were ready to form a third order of government in this country. And many leaders were quick in correcting those who were promoting that. And they were saying, no, not a third order of government. One of three orders of government. That's what we need to speak to. So there's always an issue of balance. Proper recognition that our indigenous governments would be as equal as those governments already in place. So there are many, many issues at play here. And to me, you know, not to make it hard, but I think those are the kind of hurdles that we'll need to overcome at some point. Otherwise, this is one recipe of just, you know, pushing status quo farther ahead. And it's certainly not in the interest of our peoples, but at the same time, we need to make sure that whatever process is in place, that we all have the right conditions. And certainly, it's been the history of the last 150 years for many of us, going back to the Royal Proclamation of 1763, and then the Indian Act, and then residential schools, and then you know, the Constitution, debate, Meech Lake, you know, with regards to the status of Quebec within the Constitution, and how that plays out, that plays against, you know, our own rights and our own attempts at achieving equality in this country and proper recognition. So before we even get to that question, I think that we need to secure a strong basis for our nations, and in a way, the James Bay Agreement, that was 40 years ago, a little more than 40 years ago. And the Cree Nation is just starting today to finally, how would I put it, to finally have a strong stand in terms of their own institutions, in education, in health, in justice. And it took nearly half a century. And it is taking nearly half a century. And it's not done yet. So to me, once they're done with their exercise, then they can, in a way, I guess, define the kind of relationship they want to have with both Quebec and Canada. And certainly what I can say today, despite the fact that the agreement itself has been criticized more than once over the last 40 years, is that it gave the Cree Nation a leverage that other nations don't have. You know, they probably have more capacity or more possibilities for them to walk through the doors of the parliament than I do on behalf of 9 other nations. And this is the reality, and this is the political reality that we face today. But ultimately, I would say that one of the foremost conditions is to make sure that our people are ready. And sometimes we often forget that fact. You know, the climate, the social climate in our communities is not as stable as we would like it to be. And then that really places us before, you know, much work, making sure that our people have the right foundations in order to move forward.
Thank you, Chef Picard. Just for those who might be interested to know, we just stopped in Drummondville. Drummondville is about the beginning of the Abenaki territory, coming from the west going east. The Abenaki territory is a fairly large territory. It goes all the way down to the Atlantic in Maine. It was a peaceful nation. It's a very peaceful nation that has produced actually quite a number of important artists and luminaries, at least in Quebec. You might know one of them is Alane Sobamsawin, for example, a documentary filmmaker. Actually, she made quite a few movies, documentaries, I mean, around the Oka crisis back in the 1990s. I would like maybe to ask Yannick if you have anything to say about the question that Anne Gagnon raised.
multinational federalism?
Yeah. you may not have anything. It's okay if you don't. I don't want to put you on the spot. You're the political scientist, so that's
Right.
why.
I don't know.
Do your job.
Well, I don't know if I can. I don't think I can give a better answer than Alain gave in his own reflection on it. But I think Chef Picard hit a few things on the nails on hammer nail, that expression that we use in English, by saying that, however, the arrangement or whatever model the arrangement ends up having, it has to rely on sovereignty and sovereignty of Indigenous nations. And I think that's where, when we construct models, when we start to think about how that actually looks like, or governance arrangements, it becomes a lot more difficult to become creative and to see how that works in practice when we're actually true to the principle that sovereignty lies with Indigenous nations. And so I don't think that we can ever question that. And so if we continue to acknowledge that each individual nation, and in Canada, Chef Picard says 60, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People said about 60 to 80, but then again, there's far more First Nations than that in Canada, and whatever the arrangement is, then we definitely have to we have to. I'm sorry that's. It's literally a moving conversation. So I think that one of the things as political scientists that we try to think about is then what does that arrangement look like? And what does that look like when we think about it at a pan-Canadian level, at a provincial level, but also within Indigenous nations? So I work with some Indigenous nations that are going through constitution building processes, and they're federations, and they have their own processes in place, and they're also trying to construct these arrangements and models for governance. And those models aren't the same models that we might find at the federal and the provincial level, but it's their own form of federalism and its application. So then how do we match those? And I think that having a real conversation about that, when you have federal and provincial governments at the table, Indigenous governments at the table, it's kind of tricky. And it really requires a lot of imagination. So I think as political scientists and other and judicial and other scholars, I think one of the biggest challenges is to think outside of the box and to be creative and think of ways to imagine sovereignty institutionally in a different way, and then to do so in a way that respects those fundamental principles where sovereignty lies with nations.